Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Global Network on Extremism and Technology Conference. This is the Violent Extremist Funding Panel. We have three excellent panelists with you here today to talk about their research on extremist fundraising. In the order that they'll go, that they'll present their papers, will be Andrew Mines. Andrew is a fellow at the Program on Extremism at George Washington University, where he helps lead POE's efforts on Capitol Hill siege and the Nexus project, amongst other things. Andrew will talk today about countering violent extremist funding online in the US, including the legal context and how this impacts operational and organizational side of violent extremist online funding and countering it. Next, we have Dr. Megan Squire. She's a senior fellow working on data analytics and open source intelligence at the Southern Poverty Law Center. Dr. Squire will explain how she applies her background as a computer scientist to understand complex social technical phenomena that drive online hate, particularly how hate groups finance their propaganda and activities. And last but not least, we have Ariel Bogle with us. Ariel is a researcher and a journalist with a focus on technology, online culture, and extremism. She's a reporter at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's investigation team, and she has also published research on far-right fundraising and state-linked disinformation campaigns. Ariel will discuss online fundraising tools used by far-right groups and individuals in Australia. My name is Dr. Scott Kleinmann. I'm moderating this panel. I'm a senior intelligence officer on the Sanctions Intelligence Unit at Citibank and an associate fellow at ICSR. So each of the panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll use the last 30 or so for Q&A. So without further ado, Andrew, if you want to start, please go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Scott. And thanks to the GNET team for the invitation and also for facilitating this. I know that a lot of folks are on different time zones, so appreciate everybody who's shown up at odd hours wherever you are, and it's great to be here with my co-panelists. So well, I'll be presenting on countering violent extremist fundraising online in the US. I'm going to spend a bit of time, and I apologize for those who are pretty familiar with our federal legal framework for how the US government goes about countering the financing of terrorism. It might come off as a bit of a legal 101, but I think it's important to keep in mind and keep the context of how platforms, the operational environment that kind of defines their governing policies. And so the biggest thing up top is that the way that we in the US define and then criminalize terrorism is very different from how we go about addressing extremism in this country. And so there are huge implications for the countering the financing of terrorism versus countering violent extremist fundraising. We go about these two things very differently. And that's because the way we go about countering the financing of terrorism is heavily dictated by 20 plus years of designations that have been led by our departments of state and treasury. These are really well embroiled within how our government goes about dealing with international or foreign terrorist organizations. From our perspective, that includes the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, Hezbollah, Hamas, and other organizations that we define and we prescribe as specially designated global terrorist entities or organizations. We also call them foreign terrorist organizations, as well as individuals that comprise those organizations. And so we've done a very good job over the last 20 years of prescribing them as terrorist organizations, going after their financing revenues, and basically bringing those networks down to a manageable level for law enforcement in this country. It gets a bit different overseas, but that's kind of the picture for how we handle things on the countering terrorism financing side. When it comes to countering violent extremism side, we don't really prescribe, with the exception of maybe one group, we don't describe domestic terrorist organizations in this country. We have definitions for domestic terrorism in this country, but we don't really criminalize it to any real extent in the same way that we do international terrorist organizations. And so that has major implications for how we counter domestic terrorists and domestic extremists in general. And it also has very major implications for how we go about managing their finances, if at all. And I'll get into what that means in a little bit. But this is kind of where, when we get to white supremacist, neo-Nazi, anti-government violent extremism in this country, this is where that gets a little bit tricky. There are major civil rights and civil liberties considerations in our country that federal law enforcement has to abide by, that our intelligence community has to abide by, and those can be very constricting on organized domestic violent extremist activity. But there's another side of the paper that often goes missed in this, which is the role of civil lawsuits and protecting our civil rights and civil liberties in this country. And so it kind of gets lost in the broader, countering violent extremism, countering terrorism nexus, but civil lawsuits actually play a major role in whittling away at domestic violent extremist organizations' funds and fundraising abilities in this country. And they have done so for, over 150 years at this point. That was developed in the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which was meant to protect the rights of recently enumerated Black citizens in this country. And so what that ends up doing is, over time, whittling away the fundraising ability of different Klan chapters. The Klan is an organization overall, and it basically bankrupts the organization to a large extent. How that comes into play today is that two major watershed moments in this country over the last 5 years for domestic violent extremist groups, for the right-wing extremist movement in this country, including at the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017, as well as at last year's January 6th Capitol Hill siege, riot, insurrection, however you define it, for organizers and leaders and organizations that were involved in both of those riots, protests, however you decide to define it. One is ongoing, the other has already been decided. In the previous one, a massive $25 million award was given to plaintiffs who came forward as part of that civil lawsuit. And it's ongoing in the January 6th case, but it looks like it'll probably push through, where defendants affiliated with two major organizations responsible for organizing violent activity on the day, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, will likely face severe civil monetary penalties. And so there are kind of these two components that work side by side to really go after the organizational level fundraising activities of domestic violent extremists in this country. So when we think about how that kind of builds itself into a nexus of countering violent extremism fundraising overall in the US, regardless of ideology, you can kind of split that into two distinct components and two distinct categories that we can look at and identify where the priority should be, where we're kind of succeeding, where we're kind of failing, and how online platforms fit into the picture, how online fundraising fits into the picture, and what we can be doing better on that front will be, what we maybe just can't do enough of at all, or maybe won't be able to touch in such a significant regard. And so you split that up into the operational and the organizational side. Now, on the operational side, we're very good at acronyms in this country, but for those who aren't familiar, this is how the US government goes about identifying some of the major domestic extremist threats in this country today. So racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, RMVE, anti-government and anti-authority violent extremists, agave, and homegrown violent extremists like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and others. Most often at the operational level, whether it's traveling abroad to join terrorist organizations overseas or self-financing attacks in this country, for the most part, that tends to be self-financed activities. You're looking at, regardless of ideology, average costs of somewhere below $2,000, average probably more in the $1,000 to $1,500 US dollar category. And they usually tend to fall below reporting thresholds. That said, there's often sometimes a little bit of financial intelligence that can be gathered from some of these cases. We look at it post hoc, we can say, okay, weapons purchases, armor purchases, IED component purchases, people selling off personal assets, travel purchases, other things that might make a lot of sense post hoc looking back at a case, but without other context in the moment, sometimes that can get lost. So financial intelligence for those operational components actually ends up being sometimes secondary to other online leakages that occur, whether in kind of chats online, other platform leakages that we can go through, and that I'm sure are top of everybody's mind given recent events. But oftentimes financial intelligence ends up taking a secondary role on the operational side. So in that sense, it's useful, I think, to therefore recognize the limits of where, on the operational side, countering the financing of terrorism and countering violent extremist fundraising can be prescribed, and how much of a role is there for tech companies, for online platforms to play, instead of the broader umbrella of countering violent extremism writ large, countering terrorism writ large. And so that's much more focused on supporting public health approaches to countering these issues, looking at civics, digital literacy, community engagement, and plus-upping on those instead of trying to focus on, small amounts of dollars moving online, not even moving online in many cases, and things of that nature. Then you have the organizational side. And so there are a few key takeaways that you can look at. One is that we tend to do a reasonable job of countering the financing of terrorism side. So I'm talking about international criminal terrorist organizations, I'm talking about major busts of networks of organizations that happen at the federal level and that kind of transition into action on platforms, but also syncing up civil and non-federal actions. So like those civil lawsuits that I mentioned, keeping organizations off of platforms, identifying in the wake of major civil lawsuit successes against some of these organizations, they turn to platforms to fundraise afterwards. And so recognizing when these moments occur, how they're occurring, and which platforms are probably going to be most affected, I think is key. The second side of it is continuing to deny access to major organizations and individuals. I'm talking about organizations like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers. I know some platforms have been a little bit more hesitant to address, but also engaging in some outreach, support, cooperation with smaller platforms where these organizations will often tend to go to fundraise when they can't on other major platforms. Proud Boys on GiveSendGo, most recently, Christian fundraising site, and others. And so helping smaller platforms manage these kind of cases where those kind of partnerships are capable to be made at the organizational level. And then finally, this is a little bit more for the next slide, but anticipating the second and third order consequences of rapidly integrating emerging financial technologies with communications platforms. And by that, I mean cryptocurrencies for the most part. This is a bit of a hot topic button for a lot of people today. It certainly is for me. I view this as one of the biggest potential disruptors of the last 2 decades of countering terrorism financing success in this country and possibly globally. And so I say that quite seriously. I think when you look at the global jihadist movement, their intake or maybe uptake in how they use and how eager and keen they have been organizationally, grassroots level up, to engage with cryptocurrencies, to use them, to train up operatives on how to use and exchange funds, has been pretty moderate comparatively, I think, across the globe. In the US, our homegrown violent extremists, that has been a little bit more limited comparatively. We've seen some pretty significant isolated cases where, a story breaks in the news and it's a lot of money that's moving through Bitcoin with a single, case or a single individual involved. But for the large part, it's quite limited. Now, on the flip side, and one of my co-panelists, Dr. Squire, has written about this pretty extensively, right-wing extremists have been much more advanced in taking up the mantle of cryptocurrency usage and using what's available to them to raise funds in this country. And so I won't say too much on that because I know she's probably got quite a bit planned in that regard. But I do want to talk about, quickly while I still have time, the impact of rapidly integrating cryptocurrencies into communications platforms. And by that, I mean seamlessly merging a communications platform with a mode of storing and transferring value via cryptocurrency, via blockchain technology. And there were 2 platforms over the last 4 years or so that really tried to do this, but tried to do this in a way that circumvented legal authorities that would have required them to engage, to register with the federal government, to engage in traditional countering the financing of terrorism and anti-money laundering laws, for that matter, that require them to do all these things like know your customer rules, registering and all that. And so there's a lot of potential danger that emerges when platforms try to circumvent legal authorities that exist that are in place to keep those kind of things in check. Now, there was a pretty assertive U.S. government response through our Securities and Exchange Commission. It levied lawsuits against both organizations and I think was successful in both cases. The DOJ ended up building its own cryptocurrency task force, our Department of Justice, to better manage, to better come up with not just a framework for the US, but a global framework for how to address terrorist and other criminal actors' use of cryptocurrencies going forward. And I think they raised a number of red flags that are worth mentioning, and which I did use I wrote about in an op-ed you can see in the bottom right of your screens. And so just a quick shameless shout out to that. But I think those are important things to consider. The last thing I'll say on that front is that you need to think through the second and third order effects of that seamless integration. One of the second order effects is that terrorist actors and violent extremist actors who might not have been so willing or so easily made accessible to cryptocurrencies, who might have been more hesitant, are now there are fewer barriers to entry for them to engage with cryptocurrencies. And so the overall usage amongst the population goes up. That's one second order effect. And there are other, third order effects to consider, but I think that's it. That's a key one. And so then you would see at the organizational level, not just right-wing extremists in this country, but potentially other ideologies and other movements starting to get much more involved in online fundraising through cryptocurrencies. And so at this point, that's largely speculatory, but I think this is one of those great kind of open questions, frontiers to be decided in the coming years. And it's an important time to be having these conversations. So I will finish there. I'm looking forward to the Q&A, and I'm looking forward to remarks from my co-panelists. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And now with us we have Megan. You're on.
Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Squire, and I'm a computer scientist currently at the Southern Poverty Law Center here in the U.S. The SPLC is a civil rights group, and I'm part of what's called the Intelligence Project. So what I do is use a data science approach to help them study far-right extremism online. And one of the there's four main ways for making money online for these far-right extremists that I'm interested in tracking. So in this talk, I'm going to show how I've been able to use a computer science approach or data science approach to study each of these methods individually. We'll start with donations, direct donations to personalities. These were mentioned on Andrew's slides a little bit ago. These could be media personalities, like content creators, live streamers, what have you. And the donations could be in dollars or euros or some other fiat currency, or they could be given in cryptocurrency. Thanks, Andrew, for the great tee up there. I will be talking about that quite a bit. Either way, these are direct payments from donor A to receiver B. So here's an example on your screen of a cryptocurrency solicitation page on InfoWars, which is a website dabbling in conspiracy theories. They started soliciting donations via crypto last April 2021, and you can see the variety of currencies they accept, including Bitcoin. And there's a QR code there that you can use to load the address automatically instead of having to type it into your wallet software. And what you see on the screen now is an example of how the Bitcoin blockchain or transaction ledger looks for one of the addresses advertised on InfoWars. Last month, I was barely finished drinking my coffee one morning when I noticed a really large transfer of 26 Bitcoin coming through to this InfoWars address. 26 Bitcoins worth about $1 million at the time. Maybe not after this week or last week. We hastily put together a story on this event, which was pretty large. It was the largest donation that individual had received through any of their addresses in the year that I've been tracking that. And a few days later, the same donor gave another 26 Bitcoin. So that made a very interesting week for tracking. Luckily, all the data needed to study cryptocurrency, well, most cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, is available online. It's getting a little bit harder to track, but it's still possible within reason. Another way of showing cryptocurrency payments then is through visualization. So what you see on the screen here is a diagram showing a chain of transactions, one after the other. This one shows a prior set of donations to that same InfoWars set of wallets. And we can see that two of the donations actually came from the same donor here. So this mega donor gave about $250,000, which was a big for the year that I was studying it until the 226 Bitcoin donations came in, which kind of dwarfed this one. But anyway, at SPLC, I keep a really large database of known cryptocurrency extremist addresses. So, and that list is public. So if you wanted to go grab it off the website, you can look at it. And you can do your own crypto mining of those addresses if you like, or check them in the morning when you're having your coffee. I update it about every 3 months or so. The next way that these guys make money that I'd like to talk about is merch and dues. This is the older school method of making money, but it still works and is still important. One of the very first projects that I got started on in this area was looking at Proud Boys who were using Venmo to take dues and organize events and sell merchandise, things like that. So here you can see a couple of Venmo screenshots of them taking dues and payments to rent a bus, which they're going to use to go disrupt a protest in another state. So what I decided to do is try to reverse engineer their internal organizational hierarchy, who's the leaders, who the followers, just from looking at the Venmo transactions, under the thinking that a semi-clandestine group would probably not likely shield their organizational infrastructure very well if they were using Venmo to take payments. And that because it was a small group at the time, the people taking the money might be bestowed with more leadership roles. Anyway, I produced some social networks just using that publicly available data on Venmo. The circles here represent individual Proud Boys. They're connected with lines if they've conducted payments to one another on Venmo. And the ones in red were the guys that my prediction model guessed would be the leaders of the organization. And long story short, you can go read the paper, but it turns out that receiving funds was a pretty reliable way of guessing who was also important in this particular organization. The model turned out to be about 70% correct at prediction, using only public Venmo data and like one variable, which was how many transactions they were engaging in with how many other people. So it was a really interesting learning experience for me. Not everything has to be high tech and delving deep into billions of crypto transactions. These days, I'm looking at other types of merch and dues style platforms. What you see on the screen here is a project that I have coming out in a couple weeks on another payment system, Subscribestar. This one is a platform that caters to far-right users and others, but numbers-wise, mostly far-right users who've been removed from more mainstream services like Patreon. You might have heard of that. Anyway, the subscription model, it's kind of like taking dues, except instead of paying dues to a group, you're buying a monthly subscription to content creator that you like. So it could be like a blogger or a video streamer, author, or whatever. And dues, like subscriptions, are typically around $5 a month on a site like this. So what we're looking at is how much money is changing hands using this particular model, and especially for those folks who've already been removed from more mainstream subscription platforms. What we're learning is that, and this should be out in a story in the next couple of weeks or so, but although the donation amounts are quite low, usually between $1 and $5 a month, these types of content creators are able to make up for that, usually in volume. Another way that you can make money the old-fashioned way is not necessarily through subscriptions to your content, but some creators will still make money selling products the old-fashioned way, merch, right? T-shirts, concert tickets, supplements, whatever. What you see on the screen here is the domain rankings of the InfoWars store. So when Alex Jones isn't collecting cryptocurrency, he's selling, super male vitality or whatever it is on his store. And so we can try to, from the outside looking in, try to figure out how popular that store is and those products are, try to discern how much business he's able to do on that site. Here I pulled out about 18 months of store traffic rankings to show how his store was faltering through most of 2020. You can see the sort of the lean months there in the middle. And then as the election hit and the Stop the Steal started and unfortunately also the insurrection started, traffic and rankings to his store went through the roof. I'm going to skip talking about crowdfunding for this presentation, but I do want to take a just a brief minute to talk about super chats or real-time direct donations. It's like the fourth category that I'm super interested in studying. We can call these super chats is kind of a YouTube only term, so I'm trying to come up with something that's a little bit more generic to refer to when this happens on other platforms. So I don't know, real-time donations to get attention, that's kind of a mouthful, but that's basically what's happening here. Here's an example of what this looks like on YouTube. So here we have the video streamer talking in the main window. He's performing, and the users on the right-hand side are donating money to him in real time to have their comment appear, and it's colored red or blue depending on how much money they give and stuff like that. Now, it's really hard to get data at scale out of YouTube. There's a lot of people using this feature on YouTube and making lots of money on it, but the data is really hard to get. You basically have to like watch the stream and write down the amounts, and this is extremely time consuming, right? So for somebody like me, I want to write code and pull the data out and, you know, at scale and do big studies. So I was mulling this around, like, what do I do? What do I do? And around 2020, I noticed that a lot of these extremists that have been kicked off of YouTube were going to a different site. This one was called DLive. And this site happened to have a system where I could write some software to pull the data out. They were actually using the data to advertise how much money you could make on the site, so it was available. So I did that. I wrote a bunch of code to pull all the transactions for a collection of far-right streamers that I was interested in. The site currency, which you can see here on the screen, called Lemons, you can purchase that on the site. You can don't transfer it around to the people that you like. And then, of course, you can cash out to get your money out if you're a streamer that's received a bunch of money. So I collected all of that data and studied it for about a year. And then by the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, the platform had gotten incredibly popular with these guys, to the point that some of them decided to use this very platform to stream themselves inside the Capitol building on January 6th. So what you see on the screen is an example from a screenshot from inside DLive during the insurrection, where they're using this platform to make money. One of the streamers that I studied most closely, their data you can see here on the screen. This is daily earnings data from the DLive platform. Again, this is just donations that are freely given during video live streams. So I like what you're saying. Here's some money. You can see with the tall spikes there that most of the days when this person was making $2,000 and $3,000 per day were around the election, during Stop the Steal events and promotions of those events, and then again during the insurrection itself. In total, this one individual made $116,000 in 10 months on the platform. And he was the largest streamer that I studied on that platform, but there were several others that made similar amounts. I also ended up drawing some networks because I love understanding the data in that way. But here we can see the network of donors and streamers. Streamers are colored pink, donors are gray. They're connected by how many transactions they engage in with one another. And this is only people who've received more than $125 on the platform. If I included everybody in my set, the entire screen would be black. You wouldn't be able to see anything. It would be completely covered with dots. So, but what we see here is a structure emerging in the way donors decide to donate. So there's little subgroups, little clusters, kind of like little neighborhoods, fan clubs, if you will. The cluster, though, marked A, is that one that I just showed you with the guys going and streaming inside the Capitol and the person who made $116,000. That it was a much tighter cluster. The good news is, I guess, these guys in cluster A there got all kicked off of DLive after the insurrection and their antics there. And so over the course of the ensuing year, they've had to find another way to make money. And basically at this point, their network is completely destroyed, both socially and financially. After looking at all of these different methods of fundraising, I've tried to come up with a framework. And so we'll end here. I'm just going to talk about a couple of things that I've noticed, and maybe a way to structure how we think about these different funding vehicles. So with whereas flat donations to a streamer are somewhat delayed, right? InfoWars probably didn't even notice they got that Bitcoin donation until they woke up in the next morning. The super chat style donations are immediate and happen in real time. something like a Bitcoin donation is markedly more difficult for users to engage in than something like a super chat, which is extremely easy, and you basically just mash the button on your screen, right? There's a difference there. A flat donation that comes much later and hours and days have passed. I can contrast that to a super chat style donation that happens in real time immediately from the fan to the streamer while they're talking. It's immediate and it's very intimate. And then finally, the number of people who are willing to engage in, figuring out how to use cryptocurrency and doing that is for the moment fewer than the number of people who engage in that immediate fan style real-time donation behavior so far. That could change in the future, but I was trying to set up kind of like a spectrum so we could understand the reasons why people might engage in each of these different funding mechanisms. All right, so that is my talk. I hope you have lots of questions, and I'll do my best to answer those in Q&A. So please type them into the chat. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Megan. And next we have Ariel.
Hi. Hope everyone can hear me properly. As was introduced, I'm actually a journalist here in Australia, and we're one day out from the federal election. So if people start running around screaming behind me, that's probably why. I'm just in the newsroom. I'm going to be talking about a report I published last year while working as an analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And the goal of the project really was to start mapping the online fundraising tools and platforms being used by the far right in Australia. As I said, sort of intended to create a map because this topic really hasn't been canvassed quite so heavily in Australia as it has been in the United States and in Europe. The focus really has been on other forms of extremist financing. And so when I did this preliminary map, I found more than 20 different fundraising tools and platforms being used. So I'll run through some of those platforms. There's a strong overlap, of course, with Andrew and Megan's talks and the platforms they discussed. A bit of a discussion of Telegram, because that's where my report really built out from. A brief touch on cryptocurrency, and then also looking at how fundraising helped reinforce international ties between the Australian far right and groups overseas. So as I said, sort of built a sample from Telegram. I started with a Telegram channel connected to a known white supremacist in Australia and built out through forwarded links a kind of snowball sample. So, of course, due to the kind of rapid evolution of these online ecosystems, which we can talk about a bit more about in the Q&A probably, it's necessarily like a limited snapshot, a snapshot in time. So I will just talk about how the Telegram accounts, the individuals and groups in my sample asked for money. So research, especially from the United States and Europe, a little bit in Australia, have canvassed how far-right groups and individuals make money in the past. So, of course, soliciting dues and membership fees for certain groups, events, merchandise, and, of course, this still happens. But when looking at the online fundraising efforts, I found that these demands were often for specific purposes, like I need to raise money for my legal fees. That's an example on the right, asking for legal fee donations in Monero, or for printing banners. But there was also plenty of fundraising requests which were really more framed around just akin to a sort of social media influencer model of patronage. So asking for donations as a reward for, good content, for creating credible content. And I'll note too, I think there's a strong emphasis in the range of fundraising tools being used on resisting demonetization, making sure that their online fundraising profiles were resilient to deplatforming and demonetization. So certainly the Australian far right keeps a close eye on what's happening in the United States, in North America. I think I didn't look at it in this report because it was last year, but earlier this year, the Canadian government's use of the Emergencies Act to crack down on the bank accounts of those involved in the Canadians of Freedom convoy went really noticed here in Australia, and was the subject of like much discussion amongst the far right in some of the channels I observe, and was part of a kind of push of their followers to start using cryptocurrency even more, even though of course there are some like technical inhibitions to encouraging people to use crypto over more mainstream fundraising tools. So just to briefly run over some of the fundraising platforms and tools I observed in the sample. Megan talked about DLive, and she's done some great work on that. I would say that in Australia, our figures here that are streaming, whether sporadically or whether they have a regular streaming schedule, are making nowhere near as much money as some of those key figures in the United States, and especially the kind of earnings that happened around January 6th. But nevertheless, they're certainly using it to work around certain deplatforming. So some of these people have been pushed off, say, YouTube, or they still have YouTube, but they can no longer use Super Chat or monetize their YouTube presence. So they've moved to DLive. Also, in the wake of January 6th, DLive crackdown on many accounts. It also stipulated that I think the category marked that's category X is meant to be content that deals with politics, is not about gaming or entertainment. And that kind of category should no longer be able to be monetized on DLive. But in my sample, some figures were able to get around that. So one live stream was tagged actually as being about the video game Fortnite, but was talking about its typical topics. I think too, the second one on that list of live streaming and video hosting is particularly interesting. That's Entropy, because again, to come back to this question of demonetization, Entropy kind of wraps around other live streams. So it's a video platform that allows people to port streams from, say, YouTube, DLive, Twitch, etc. And so that even if an individual has had their ability to accept tips or advertise on other platforms removed, they can kind of wrap the tool Entropy around their stream. And so as an example of how Entropy was used among my sample, one individual would stream regularly on all platforms, YouTube, DLive, Twitch, but would only answer questions from his audience via paid chat on Entropy. So, for example, there was a stream last year where individuals paid between US $3 and US $50 to ask questions of a known white supremacist figure in Australia. And of course, I'll talk a bit more about crypto later on, but you can see there that all in sort of mainstream cryptocurrencies were used among my sample as well. So to briefly note too, I think in general, these fundraising tools that I found among my Australian sample are mainstream fundraising platforms used by many other types of people as well. So there was a lot of use of PayPal, paypal.me pages, kind of like your own PayPal website that you can advertise, Patreon, Subscribestar, as Megan also talked about. And then I think what would be another interesting sort of point of investigation would be the use of advertising, like Google and Facebook advertising programs and Amazon's associates programs. So at least a couple of figures in my sample were using affiliate links to Amazon, which would give them a small amount of revenue if people use those links to purchase books or other gear. So just talk about Telegram and its role in this ecosystem that I looked at. So of course, Telegram itself is not currently a payment platform, although as Andrew alluded to, it did attempt to set up a cryptocurrency a year or two ago, but sort of abandoned that project after a pretty strong pushback from the SEC. But it really played a very sort of important role as a guide and point of communication with followers. So I think it was potentially used to centralize people's online presence because people feel quite confident that their Telegram channels will remain up or at least be slightly more resilient than accounts on other platforms, Facebook, YouTube, etc. And so the fundraising links were often shared across the channel's online presence, creating a network with a plethora of funding options. So on screen now is a kind of map I created of one account's links. So you can see Telegram up the top, but almost every other fundraising tool they used, and they used almost everyone possible in the sample linked back to Telegram or linked back to another fundraising tool. So if one goes down, there's plenty of other options. Or this person was no longer able to use YouTube Super Chat because of the nature of his content, but that YouTube account had a PayPal link, donation link at the bottom. So yeah, just to briefly touch on cryptocurrency, as I said, Bitcoin, Monero, Litecoin, Ripple, Ethereum, all were used by parts of the sample. I think definitely since this report was done last year, the use of Monero has really gone way up, just anecdotally from looking at those same accounts more recently. I think, too, we can talk about this a bit more as well, but certainly the use of cryptocurrencies is part of a push of distrust, I guess, of traditional financial institutions by these actors. And in some cases, you know, the developers of these coins have explicitly cultivated this perception or encouraged it in some way. And I would arguably put Monero in this category. There are plenty of sort of Monero fan accounts, for want of a better way to put it, on Telegram, that although you can see on the left, this is a figure in Australia who was charged with a number of offences last year, including the assault of a security guard in Australia, and had his legal fee donation drive kind of promoted by Monero fan accounts on Telegram. So as well, to briefly touch, as I mentioned on those, the way the online funding mechanisms in the report serve as a connection between Australian right-wing extremists and those in overseas sort of jurisdictions. I think Telegram and its forwarding function really allows messages to quickly be forwarded into other groups, and has really allowed those links to build up. It kind of creates a roadmap so you can sort of trace back. If you see Thomas Sewell's sort of legal fundraising requests being forwarded into an international channel, you can follow back and find his channel and subscribe. So this is a map on the screen of the pleas for support for Sewell's legal fund in March, which could be provided in Monero or in Buy Me a Coffee donations as sort of another micro donation website, forwarded into myriad North American right-wing extremist Telegram channels, some with more than 50,000 followers, some in Europe, and of course, plenty in Australia as well. And just as a sort of side note too, there was a kind of confluence between the content that Sewell created with his activities, so a video of the assault of the security guard in Sydney, and his donation request. So the legal, I suppose, is kind of a tie between the kind of content he created for people that are fans of his or subscribe to his ideology, and his Monero legal request fund. So conscious of time, I'm just going to skip past platform policies, and we can talk about it a bit more, but suffice it to say, almost all the platforms I looked at in my sample had some kind of policy that touched on far-right fundraising, but not in much detail, and enforcement, of course, remains rather arbitrary. And of course, there's plenty of sticky questions around the appropriateness of demonetization and deplatforming, which we can talk about. But yeah, I think I'll finish up there. But, you know, in general, I will say that the funds raised by my sample, which I looked at last year, were limited, especially compared to the kind of fundraising we've seen in North America. And that could be, you know, a sense of scale. Of course, Australia is a smaller country, and the audience is necessarily limited. There have been Australian figures who have achieved a small amount of international fame, and at that point, their fundraising is really able to grow exponentially. And yeah, there's plenty of questions here too about the Australian law enforcement response or policy response, which we can discuss in more detail. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ariel. That was good. I have a few questions, and then we have some questions from people in the audience. First, starting with Megan, in your paper, Monetizing Propaganda, you mentioned, and a little bit in your presentation today too, you mentioned that the DLive donation networks are very fractured. I got the impression from reading your paper that the streamers sort of have dedicated, loyal fan bases. Is there any evidence of funding crossover where single donors are funding multiple groups or multiple celebrity streamers or across ideologies? And if not, do we see the same kind of fracturing in other spaces?
Yeah, it really did look a lot like a fan club network. There were pretty discrete subgroups. Now, there was that messy middle area that I showed. That was really in two parts. I didn't go into it a lot when I was talking, but it is, I do talk about it in the paper a little bit. There's sort of a ex-YouTube streamers, sort of C-list, D-list level streamers section. And there's a lot of small pink circles and small gray, so, small streamers and small time donors. And everybody's just kind of giving each other $1, And then there was Group A over here, which was the America First, Nick Fuentes sort of wing. And they were very high value. They were receiving a lot of donations. And within that group, there was a lot of swapping around. The mega donors, especially that gave in that group, would give to sort of all of those guys, not necessarily equally. And there was reasons why they would give more and less at a certain time. But yeah, they would play around, and there was a little bit of mixing there. But in some of those other groups, like those discrete groups B, C, D that were labeled on my chart, those were very, very separated out. One of those was like a Proud Boys stream. One of those was Owen Benjamin, who's like this sort of calls himself a alt-right comedian or something like that. These guys did not tend to cross over at all. And you might have noticed off to the side, there was one little chunk that wasn't connected in at all. That's a German language streamer. So absolutely no crossover there. So it just depends.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One more question while I have you here.
Oh yeah, did you want us to turn our cameras off? I wasn't sure if they were just stay on. Okay.
You were talking about merch. We've seen some of the groups selling sort of lifestyle brand sales, Rise, Pine Watch. Where do you see this going in 5 years? And I guess looking at some of the work from like Cynthia Miller-Eders, about the work she's done with German nationalists, do you see any relationship or connection between the expansion in lifestyle brand sales and growing networks?
Yeah, there's a book network that's interesting. There's clothing networks now that are kind of interesting. It's sort of branched out beyond just the supplements. There's a soap network. People, if I come across one more extremist soap company, I'm going to scream. But yeah, I don't think they're pulling in a lot, but they are starting to use it as camaraderie. And there's this idea that we're going to create an alternate economy. And so if we all just buy our soap from this one place, we're going to save the white race or whatever the fantasy is. Yeah, I'm not sure how realistic that is, but they are trying it. So that's concerning. And anything that fosters extra community and extra camaraderie in these groups, I'm not a fan of that. So I'm certainly watching it. I'm not sure how to tell you in dollars. It would be very hard to predict that out of how much they're making, but I can't say it's probably very much, especially in some of those verticals. So,
thank you, Andrew. Picking up on you mentioned earlier. Some of the platforms got pushback from financial regulators regarding KYCs and things like that. Have we seen any civil enforcement actions from any of the major regulators? Is there any evidence that there might be opportunities for sort of an Al Capone strategy where getting these guys for tax evasion, racketeering, or enforcement actions against, say, nonprofits promoting partisan politics or candidates as another possible option for countering the extremist financing?
I think law enforcement tends to use whatever tools they have available. I mean, the whole Al Capone style we see that with the jihadist side of things. So you could definitely see that being applied in this setting too. When I say the jihadist side of things, I mean like when you can't guarantee that an individual who's mobilizing on support of the Islamic State, let's say, is going to end up getting done in on material support to terrorism charges. There are whole other charges available in our tool set that come to play. And I could see those definitely being used in this situation too. And then in terms of kind of like the broader point that you mentioned on the first half of that question, that those two major regulatory actions were part of a broader kind of phase of rollout from the Department of Justice and the SEC and CFTC, or Commodities and Futures Trade Commission. And so like there were a bunch of different regulatory actions that came out in quick succession from 2017 through 2021, including when the US was at the head of the Financial Action Task Force. So like there was this sequence of regulations that showed that the US was starting to take a little bit more of an assertive approach on cryptocurrencies, much more of a regulatory approach when it came to, some of the larger cryptocurrencies, and taking down exchanges, regardless of whether it was terrorism related. There's other criminal activity that was going on in some of those exchanges too. And so I think that, that all ends up kind of culminating in that DOJ strategy paper, our Department of Justice strategy paper that I mentioned. And so if that is to truly guide the years ahead, that's a more assertive approach for the US. It's also a more kind of internationally assertive approach. And so I think there were some questions in there about Rex for the UNSC and other stuff. So I think in terms of any rec that I could give, it would be to use that sort of as a blueprint for an international rallying effort around formal guidance and then a formal kind of framework for addressing cryptocurrencies. And that doesn't have to be just terrorism related. That can address other issues too.
Okay, thank you. And Ariel, I wanted to touch a little bit more on the international aspect of American groups operating in connections with the Australian groups. One, have you seen any kind of organizational learning where Americans are teaching the Australians or vice versa on operational security, different methods, different rooms, and specifically, I'd be interested in learning more about any evidence that they're suggesting extremist financing outside of crypto, like other kinds of blockchain technologies, crypto adjacent assets, NFTs that might be being used to launder money. And are there any concrete examples you can think of that where these types of issues are being discussed in Telegram?
Sure. So certainly I think when I think about the groups and channels accounts I looked at last year, there was not a great deal of evidence of like direct instructional, intelligence sharing between the two, but there's just a lot of observation, copying, improving on. So sort of like an international dialogue. I will say though that there was plenty of conversation happening, shared podcasts, shared live streams between Australian far-right figures and US far-right figures in which fundraising was discussed. So like the dialogue is certainly there. On the NFT, I wish I had a great answer on the NFT question. I really don't, but I will say that Australians are certainly a part of this international ecosystem. And just to come back to that example with the Canadian convoy earlier this year, when there was that big leak or hack and leak of Give, Send, Go donation data that was donations to support the convoy in Toronto, there were hundreds and hundreds of Australians who made donations to that convoy. It became quite a significant event for certain parts of the Australian population. A lot of groups associated with the anti-lockdown, anti-vaccination movements here in Australia, a number of far-right groups as well. So certainly, I can't remember the exact figure, but it was certainly tens of thousands of dollars that Australians sent to Canada. There's also been figures, particularly a Australian teenager actually, who became, I think at one time, the 5th highest earner on DLive, which we briefly touched on, who eventually traveled to the United States to hang out with Nick Fuentes, who Megan touched on, and a number of other sort of quite significant far-right figures, and to hang out and to boost the earning potential together, I suppose, by joint streaming, joint fundraising efforts. So there's a lot of like informal and slightly more formal kind of interaction between Australia and overseas networks.
And then building off the question that I asked Megan about fractured networks, do you see that same kind of fracture amongst the Australians, or
like what happens when they get pushed off?
Ideological fracturing or group fracturing, are they clumped into this group supports Proud Boys, this is an Oath Keeper group, in the Telegram channels and in funding?
Yeah, certainly there's, internal infighting, the result of pure personality clashes, also clashes of ideology. There is a kind of, I don't want to use the word nascent, a small, persistent, but small and pretty ad hoc kind of Proud Boys chapter that has been attempted to set up here in Australia, has some presence, has turned up at protests and things, but certainly nowhere near the scale of the United States. There are plenty of groups in Australia that have a more established kind of homegrown presence. I think there's a fracturing, I think, but often it is like a personality driven rather than ideological. People fighting with each other, being seen to not be as loyal to the cause or as dedicated to the cause. And then, of course, the perennial issue or the perennial suspicion that somebody has turned. And this is like a snitch now, for want of a better way to put it. These are the kinds of fractures that I'm being seen.
Okay, thanks. Can you guys see the chat questions rolling in? Is there any that maybe you wanted to speak to over video rather than?
I answered one of them in there, but I was trying to make my way through. I just started at the bottom, so I guess that's not really fair to the first questions. I can make my way back up. But
I haven't had a chance to go through them yet.
yeah, some of them are asking a lot about GoFundMe and the sort of the one type of funding that I skipped over, right? Those are where the questions come in. So there were some really high profile leaks around that Give Send Go data and the GoFundMe's and all that kind of stuff. And so that was I think one of the questions was about whether Canada, the government, like basically taking the wind out of that convoy donation moment by passing that emergency act or whatever, what the effect of that was. And I'm sorry, I didn't study that specifically, so I don't know what that would be, but I'm sure the CBC or somebody up in Canada has done a study of that. I just don't know what to, how to point you to that. But I know there were a lot of people looking at that data and that exact question. That was a very big story, we'll recall, from the fall. So.
I guess I'll say there's a question about getting easier to track cryptocurrency transactions, and definitely Megan's an expert in the room on that. I will say that it does appear, at least my understanding of the Australian context, is the pressure points. Of course, for researchers, there's plenty of data in public, in the blockchain. There are those privacy coins that make it much more difficult, of course, but people are working on it. Like there does, there's a little bit of a movement on that. But when it comes to law enforcement, I think it's the pressure points, the exchanges, when the money is converted back to fiat into bank accounts, that's, at least for Australian law enforcement, my understanding is where the pressure is often applied. So at least one figure in my sample was sort of debanked, I suppose, after being convicted of a number of crimes related to his ideology here in Australia. And that's where the kind of pressure points remain.
Yeah, I mean, crypto is pretty easy to track with a giant if after that. If obfuscation measures aren't taken or aren't taken correctly or seriously, and if you know the address. Now we have a advantage in that these guys are soliciting money, so they have to give an address at some point of where to send it. where to send the crypto to. So that's a big plus. That helps a lot. That allows you to see the front end, the money flowing in. But when the money's coming out through, like Ariel said, some of those exchanges and stuff, that's where it gets kind of tricky. There's mixing services. There's ways of, being shady with your Bitcoin and all that. So that does make it challenging. I still think it's, compared to a private bank account, which I can't see at all, at least this gives me some kind of idea of what's going on. So I appreciate it in that way. But yeah, the privacy coins like Monero and stuff, that's basically like we're back to bank accounts again. On the upside, there's, a lot of the movement of these guys, they don't like those other coins. They want to stay in Bitcoin because it's worth more, right? It has more potential, or it did, volatility. But yeah, they like that coin. They liked that coin better because it presented more of a financial possibility for them. So
I'll just add that there are a number of examples in the U.S. context, maybe more so on, maybe not the right-wing extremist side, but more so on the jihadist side, and in other contexts too, not just the U.S., but where our investigative forces, our DOJ and others, have been pretty successful at using those touch points that Megan and Ariel have described to uncover and then expand existing investigations or start new investigations into networks. And so that actually ends up being, to the question, that ends up being a really major touch point for our government to get into the hard work of uncovering networks and then rooting them out, at least where there's like a tangible terrorism financing connection. So yeah, in some respects, it can hurt.
I don't think many figures probably that we're talking about have the wherewithal or the infrastructure to create their own cryptocurrency. There might be some examples, but certainly just to think about some reporting a colleague and I did recently about a cryptocurrency that's been created and endorsed by Steve Bannon, who I'm sure everybody's familiar with. That company linked to that cryptocurrency is based out of the British Virgin Islands. It's gone out of its way to not get into US jurisdiction. It's an interesting development, although it's impossible to say how much money they're really making on that coin because they only trade it on their own exchange and it's registered in the British Virgin Islands again. But anyway, a potentially interesting development as well.
To any of you, what is the chatter around the crypto crash the last few weeks?
I got so many people asking me that. They're like, are they really mad? Are they on there talking about how mad they are and how much money they lost? It's like, no, they're never going to admit that. They're never going, so no, they're not really talking about it. Or they're saying that they, they're going to beat it. They're going to buy the dip, whatever. It's just.
All right, well, I think we're out of time. So thank you, everyone. If you can, I'm not sure if you'll still be able to answer questions after this in the chat, but thank you all. You had very interesting, informative presentations, and hopefully I'll see you all in real life someday.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
All right, bye.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Scott. Thanks, everyone.
Sure.